Welcome back to the Sharing English podcast, where we explore stories from the English-speaking world, spoken slowly and clearly for curious English learners like you. Let's get started. Hey everyone, it's your host Freya. Imagine this. You're traveling in the United States. You go out to eat at a restaurant. You enjoy your meal, the service is good, and then the bill arrives. But the total on the bill isn't really the final total. Now you have to decide, how much should you tip? This is one of the most confusing parts of visiting or living in the United States. And it's something my students ask about all the time before they travel to the US. So in today's episode, we're going to break it all down. How tipping works, why it exists, what happens if you don't tip, and how it compares to other English-speaking countries. Let's start simple. What is tipping? A tip is extra money you give to someone for a service. In the United States, tipping is common in places like restaurants, bars, taxis or ride shares, beauty salons, among other places. And here's the important part. In the US, tipping is often expected, not just optional. So what do people actually do when it comes to tipping? At a restaurant, the standard tip is usually 15 to 20% of the bill, with 20% being very common for good service. Personally, that's almost always the amount that I tip, unless I didn't like the service so much. At a bar, you tip about $1 to $2 per drink, or again around 20% of the total bill. And for other services, like a taxi or ride share, about 10 to 15% of the trip, and a hairdresser, about 15 to 20%. And here's something important to remember. These rules are usually not written anywhere clearly. You're not going to walk into a restaurant or a hair salon and see, please tip 20% on the wall anywhere. It's just a part of the culture. Now let's get to the most important question. Why in the world does this system exist? In the United States, many service workers, especially in restaurants, are paid something called a tipped minimum wage. This is lower than the standard minimum wage, which is already ridiculously low at around $7 federally. So a tipped minimum wage can be as low as $3, $4, maybe even lower, depending on the state or city. The idea is that tips from customers will make up the difference. So for many servers, tips are not just extra money. They're a major part of their income. They have to pay taxes on the amount of tips they receive every year. And in hair salons, for example, many stylists are part of a system where they rent a chair from a salon owner, and a portion of what they earn doing your hair or other beauty procedure goes to the salon owner, while the tip you give them is only for them. This all means that when you leave a tip, you are not only rewarding good service, you're also helping pay that person's wages. Okay, but why is it like this? The tipping system in the US has historical roots going back to the 1800s, when tipping became more common in restaurants and hotels. Over time, businesses began to rely on tipping instead of paying full wages to service workers. Today, that system still exists in many parts of the country. Some people support it because they feel it rewards good service. Others criticize it because it puts pressure on workers and customers. So tipping in the US is not just a habit, it's part of a larger economic and cultural system. But what happens if you don't tip? This is something many visitors don't think about. and why should you? If you don't tip in a restaurant in the United States, it can be seen as a sign that something was wrong with the service, or it can be seen as just plain disrespectful. But more importantly, it can directly affect the worker's income. Since tips are expected, not tipping means that the server may earn very little for that table. That's why people often feel strong social pressure to tip. Let's look at some useful vocabulary you might hear. A big tipper is someone who gives generous tips. A bad tipper is someone who gives very small tips or none at all. There's also a term you might hear in the restaurant industry, the Sunday crowd. This refers to people who go out to eat after church on Sundays and are sometimes known, fairly or unfairly, for tipping poorly. You might also hear the phrase, to stiff someone. This means to not leave a tip at all. For example, they stayed for 2 hours and then stiffed the server. These expressions give you a sense of how strongly tipping is connected to social expectations. Today, tipping has become even more visible. You may see digital screens suggesting tip amounts, automatic percentage options, or even tipping prompts in places where tipping wasn't common before. This can sometimes make people feel pressured to tip more often or at higher amounts. Now let's zoom out. In other English-speaking countries, tipping works differently. In the UK, tipping is appreciated but not always expected. Sometimes a service charge is already included. In Canada, tipping is very similar to the US. 15 to 20% is common. In Australia and New Zealand, tipping is not a big part of the culture. Workers are generally paid higher wages. Tipping is optional and often small. So the key difference is this. In many countries, tipping is a bonus. In the United States, it's a part of the system and often necessary for service workers to be able to live. For visitors, this can feel confusing or even uncomfortable. You're expected to know rules that are not always explained. You might worry about tipping too little, tipping too much, or tipping in the wrong situation, and that's completely normal. If you're in the US and unsure what to do, here's a simple guideline. At a sit-down restaurant, tipping around 18 to 20% is a safe and respectful choice. And remember, people generally understand that visitors are learning. Tipping in the US is about more than just money. It reflects how work is structured, how service is valued, and how social expectations develop over time. And like many cultural practices, it can feel confusing from the outside. So now I'm curious. What is tipping culture like in your country? Is it expected, optional, or not common at all? Let me know. Thanks for listening to the Sharing English podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, I'd love it if you'd subscribe, leave a rating or review, and share the podcast with a friend who's also learning English. You can find out more about me and the podcast at our website, www.sharing-english.com. New episodes of the Sharing English podcast are available weekly wherever you listen to podcasts. As always, let me know, what topics are you interested in hearing more about? Until next time, keep listening, keep learning, and keep sharing English.